Hi there, welcome to this first video, which is really about unpicking what is going to be the best strategy, what's going to be the best vision for the kind of unit that you want to set up. Just a quick reminder, I am self-employed and I cannot afford to work for free. So please, if you didn't purchase this video, please stop watching and contact me directly. Okay. So where's the best place to start with all of this? I'm going to give you the best piece of advice that I can about running a unit for children at risk of exclusion or suspension, children who are struggling to kind of engage in mainstream, and children who are struggling to even attend school. And I think the best place to start with is thinking about who is going to end up in your unit. So I would say expect the following. Expect children with complex needs. Expect to have children with undiagnosed special educational needs, and obviously that includes mental health difficulties. Expect a disproportionately high number of welfare issues. And I think most importantly, expect all these things to co-occur within the same student. Now, why is it so important to have this as our starting point? Well, there can be, I think, a misconception about the kind of student who ends up in internal alternative provision. And I think it's most likely to come from people who haven't spent a lot of time working in these kind of settings. But it is that the children who are going to end up in your unit basically are just making poor choices, that they are choosing to misbehave, that they just need firmer boundaries, that they just need to kind of have a better sense of gratitude for what they are receiving in mainstream. So actually correcting that misconception and having this as a clear vision might be a really useful starting point. Why is it so important that this is our point to build from? Because if you accept that those are going to be the students in your unit, that's going to change everything about your planning. I'm not going to say it's going to make everything easy, but it will make things easier in terms of streamlining a vision, because that is going to affect your decisions about how you staff your unit, how you timetable your unit, what kind of curriculum you have in your unit, how you make your unit a safe place, the safest possible place for students to exist and staff to exist and for people to learn. So that's why I've put that as my fundamental, because that is the basis, the platform, I think a sensible platform from which to build. So what I'm going to do here is put up some aims or some functions of internal alternative provisions in school. This is not a list of what you should do. This is essentially a list of different aims and objectives that I'm aware that schools have had for their units. So the first one is to deter poor behaviour. We'll come on to how it might be best to do that if that is one of your aims, I think a little bit later. A second one is to re-engage students. Now that might be to re-engage students with learning. It might be to re-engage students with school itself, to re-engage students with peers, or to re-engage students with successful student-teacher relationships. So there's very many different levels when we're thinking about re-engagement. This is a very common one. Common aim of a unit is to prevent future suspension or ultimately exclusion from the school. An aim to improve either a single behaviour, or I think more commonly to improve multiple aspects of behaviour. Units can be used as a timeout or time in space, essentially a timeout from mainstream, but in reality it's actually a time in. The difference between time out and time in is ultimately that time out is something that a student can experience by themselves, whereas time in, which is really what the unit will be, is about spending time in a space with a lot of adults that are there to support. Punishment. Units can be used as a straight out punishment for a severe incident. Some schools have used units to integrate a student to a school. It might be that they have come from alternative provision, and this will be their first mainstream school. It might be that a school is receiving a student on the basis of a managed move and has decided that the best way of integrating them might be to have a placement in the unit before moving to the mainstream school. So that's something that some schools do. Increasing attendance can be a purpose of the unit. So either students who are struggling to attend lessons or to attend school. Sometimes the function of a placement is to remove a student from mainstream, and there's various reasons why that might be deemed necessary or useful. Specific emotional support. Say, for example, a student has been through a traumatic bereavement, and we might think about putting them in a unit to get a higher degree of attention, really, and support from a smaller number of adults, reduce the potential number of triggers, perhaps, depending on how your unit is set up. Units can be a great place to assess from. What kind of things are we assessing? It's really about unpicking what the barriers are for that student in terms of accessing mainstream or engaging successfully in a school environment. So there's a lot of assessment that can be done with a smaller number of students and people who have the skill set and the time to really pay attention to the details in terms of what's going on with that student. Sometimes it's a safeguarding placement, and it's essentially a form of risk management, why a student might be taken away from mainstream or placed in a much smaller setting. Okay, what I'm going to put up now are some objectives, some aims or some functions that you are not going to hear said explicitly by schools. You're not going to see them on the school website. You're certainly not going to see them in the school's behaviour policy, but I have seen them happen. So, for example, using a unit as a holding pen. An example would be if it's believed that a student is not going to return to mainstream. Perhaps you think that they're about to get an educational healthcare plan and be moved to another setting. Perhaps it's at the end of year 11, and you don't think that they're going to go back into mainstream. So essentially, they're just held in a unit. Kind of twinned with that, particularly when it comes to year 11, sometimes units are used as a replacement for permanent exclusion. So, for example, there's a serious incident with a group of year 11s. It is approaching exam season. So rather than permanently exclude, some schools might choose to place those students within the unit setting until they leave for either study leave or exams. Some units are designed to be a kind of scared straight intervention. That name comes from the US TV show that essentially took children who were at risk of future criminal behavior and took them into prison and tried to give them as negative experience as possible to try and deter them. I will just point out that it actually had the opposite effect. So scared straight is not a very evidence-informed version of a deterrent. And I've definitely seen some of this. So a kind of board straight, where the impact of limiting curriculum, limiting support, limiting experiences that are available within a unit are an attempt to motivate students to re-enter mainstream as fast as possible. So essentially by boring them into wanting to return to mainstream and therefore altering their behaviour. So what I'm going to do now is try and give you perhaps a little bit of advice, because there's some quite disparate objectives there. First question for you to have a think about right now is, what are your objectives for your unit? If you have a unit up and running, do you know them? Or is it a case of you would know where they are written down, but they're not currently in your mind? It's worth having to think about how useful your objectives are and what part of a conversation they are. But some advice about those objectives. First one, I would say plans and boundaries. So unit cannot be everything to everyone, although it is sometimes erroneously used in that way. it can be a difficult question. So which of those objectives are you not going to have for your unit? Which children in which situation are you not going to place in your unit? And that's hard, and it's a part of a broader conversation about school systems in your setting. Second thing, I did mention some bad ideas. Even if people aren't explicit about having those perceptions that that's how a unit should be, or it would be more effective if we bored them or gave them a really uncomfortable experience or just held them there for really long periods of time. Even if people aren't explicit about that, they may still think that. So I think sometimes it's worth actively naming those bad ideas and explaining and talking through why. The why, what is your vision as to why your unit is not going to be those things? It is always worth considering what are the priorities of your unit, and sometimes that might be in terms of balancing out, your different staffing, your different capacities, and building around those priorities. And then the last one is, it's worth asking if there are any objectives on that list that are actually incompatible as part of your vision. So I'm going to give an example of one that I struggle with that I think might not be compatible. And that is punishment. So the reason I'm bringing up punishment is that it is, I think, a really complicated part of the discourse. But essentially, I think this is a really powerful image, because what there can be an attempt to do sometimes is to incorporate punishment and support within the same setting, not just as temporary moments, but as an ethos, as a vision behind the whole thing. And what that's really doing is asking children to be pulled in two different directions. It's also asking staff to be pulled in two different directions. So if you think about some of the other aims that you might have within your unit, the question becomes, is it possible to design a setting whose main focus is, for example, re-engagement, is assessment, is to encourage children to be attending school, and at the same time, for the purpose of that setting, to be focused on punishment? In terms of your staffing, how reasonable is it to ask your staff to have, for example, a heavy focus on punishment within the setting, and then at the same time deliver a re-engagement curriculum, deliver emotional support, support students in integrating or reintegrating back into mainstream? So I've certainly played roles within a school at the same time that had very different kind of personas. So part of my role was to be essentially an enforcer, be the scary person who walked around the school picking things up. At the same time, run a unit like this, which was obviously very supportive, in my case, of the students who displayed some of the most challenging behaviour. So whilst it is possible to play both those roles, I'm not sure that I have ever figured out a way to design a setting where you are, where you have the vision to do both at the same time. Now, it's entirely possible to have a supportive setting that you designed and to take out a student and sanction them from it. What I'm talking about is actually the entire design of it and how it is set up and what your processes are, what your policy is in that unit. Is it possible to maintain it as a space of punishment and at the same time do all these other things? And that's where I would go back to what's the foundation by saying, who do I have in my unit? And remember, our fundamental is that students are going to have complex needs. Students are going to have undiagnosed SEND. Students are more likely to have welfare issues. So I think from there, realistically, a decision has to be made. Having said that, are there some very reasonable concerns that come out of these kind of questions? I think yes. And I think it's important to talk about those. So reasonable concerns that might be triggered, for example, by some of these comments. So if a young person comes into the unit and within a week says, I want to stay here forever, is that a legitimate concern? Yes, it's probably more likely to be an ongoing concern. But does it worry people? I think yes. I think it also kind of emotionally triggers people who don't want a student to feel rewarded if there's been a history of challenging behaviour and for significant incidents. So a lot of people won't want a student to come into a unit and feel good about it. Another one, this is way better than mainstream. Legitimate concern. What if they deliberately try and delay their reintegration to mainstream because they're enjoying the unit so much? Perhaps another student who's not in the unit saying, well, I don't want to go to French, can't I go to the unit instead? Does that trigger people? Does that upset people? Yes, it does. And the bottom one is I've actually been in a situation where a parent has essentially said, well, the student says they're not coming in unless they're in the unit. Does that feel for a second like manipulation? Possibly. Does it raise some legitimate concerns? Yes. So I wanted to kind of talk about these, these moments that trigger those concerns. So my tips in this situation, the first one would definitely be take a time out and let the emotional responses to these subside. And the main reason for that is that we do not set strategy, we do not set vision on the basis of comments like these. Okay, the fact that a child has come into the unit and a week in has said, I want to stay here for the rest of my education, that is not significant enough to change the way that we set up our unit. Okay, just that moment by itself. And I think there is a danger when people have these legitimate concerns that you end up swinging again from punitive responses, who are desired by some people, and other people desire a more rehabilitative response. And some people want a more trauma-informed response, and some people are putting in evidence, from lots of different places. And that is where you end up being a candle in the wind. I think what's particularly useful when faced with these issues is to think about what is underpinning that moment and what's underpinning that statement. So why did that child announce that he wanted to stay in the unit forever? Well, it turned out that's because, according to his mum, that was his first experience of ever enjoying school. It was the first time he had ever wanted to go to school. So in a sense, that is extremely significant to understand what is underneath that. What is underpinning a parent phoning up and saying, my child's not coming in unless they are put in the unit? Probably, I'd imagine, quite a lot of stress at home. Could be quite a difficult relationship because the child is exhibiting a lot of anxiety about attending school. That can be very difficult for the parent to manage in terms of communication with the school. Should we feel, I don't know, threatened by anything that's viewed as manipulative on the part of that parent? My instinct is no, because schools have the authority to do what is in the best interest of the child regardless. So I think more than that, it's about exploring with that parent where that anxiety is coming from and having that conversation rather than reacting in a kind of defensive stance. Last thing I'd say about people who have these concerns and want units to apply more of a punishment approach or become more of a deterrent. Motivators and deterrents for individual students, I've learned through experience, are very hard to predict. I'll give you an example. So I've had quite a few students now who want to stay in the unit for break time and lunchtime. Is that predictable? Yes, if you've got experience, but I would imagine for most mainstream educators who haven't done that role, no. They would expect a child to want to spend time with their friends and want to be out at break time and lunchtime at the same time as the rest of the school. So when you're considering these aspects of what's comfortable and what's not, you actually just have to step back and go, every student is different. It's not that predictable when you're talking about a very small number of students who will have complex needs. Okay, so that was a brief introduction into thinking about your vision and your strategy for the unit, and perhaps how to communicate that vision and strategy. What I might suggest as some next steps at the end of this video is to think about what are the priorities of your unit. If you currently don't have any written priorities, enjoy. What a great opportunity to sit down and start creating that list and start sharing that vision. Once you have them, or if you already have them, it's always important to consider if all the leadership team are on board with these, if all the leadership voices within the school are on board with this vision. And do the staff understand what you are doing? So I think when there's a lack of understanding and a lack of communication, it's staff can feel quite disgruntled about what they perceive as the functions of a unit. I'm not saying you can get all staff to agree with your vision, but I think at least it helps if it is clearly articulated. And always think about, because it will happen if you are in leadership, as I'm sure you already know if you're watching this, and you are you ready? Do you have the answers when people challenge you on your strategy and on your vision? And if you do ever want to talk about these, jump onto my website and we could perhaps have an online session, and I can support you in kind of building that ethos and perhaps work on being able to face those challenges down. Okay, thanks for watching.